Ableton Live 11.3, there's a new synthesizer called Drift. And Drift is meant to be extremely expressive and to capture the inconsistencies and warmth of real analog hardware synthesizers. And if you've paid any attention to the sound design work I've done in my hundreds of Ableton Live packs over the last few years, then you can probably guess that I love Drift. I've been designing my own presets for Drift for the last couple weeks, and it's incredible. Right now you're hearing me improvise on some of those presets I made with Drift. I've got a free pack of 10 presets that you can have for your music over at brianfunk.com/drift. It even includes a 16-pad drum rack where each drum sound is made up of a Drift preset. But I actually made 50 different presets. And all 50 of those presets are only available to members of my music production club because you guys are my biggest supporters. Members of the music production club always get my newest creation as soon as it's released. My educational materials, including video courses, my books, helpful PDFs, and they're part of a really cool, supportive community of fellow music makers. And I love that community. We have a Discord server where I get to hear people's music. We get together and hang out for live Zoom meetings, share our music, share tips, do projects together. It's so much fun and really exciting and inspiring for me to share this community with everybody. And there's also bonus materials for the Music Production Club, which are basically just free stuff from my store that I put on there every once in a while. So if you want to get all 50 of these Drift presets, sign up for the Music Production Club at brianfunk.com/MPC. I'm really proud of these presets. They're so expressive and deep, and some of them have maybe a reverb or a delay on them, or maybe an arpeggiator, but almost all of them are just Drift itself without any effects. It's amazing what you can do with this synthesizer, and I had a lot of fun making these sounds. And I think they're going to work really nicely in all kinds of different music genres. So if you want to get your hands on 10 free Drift presets, go to brianfunk.com/drift. If you want all 50, join the club. brianfunk.com/MPC. Thanks a lot and enjoy this episode of the Music Production Podcast. Hello, and thank you for listening or watching the Music Production Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Funk, and on today's show, I have a special guest. I have EmmoLei Sankofa, and she's a composer, producer, musician. She just finished work on the Hulu series 3 Ways, and she's
it's a movie, actually.
Oh, it's a movie. I'm sorry. So
Yeah.
It's the movie 3 Ways, and she's got all kinds of work, which is really fun, and I think there's going to be a lot of things to talk about, from music, visual media, fine art, a lot of cool philosophical stuff that I came across too. So I'm really excited to talk to you,
that's
EmmoLei.
my favorite stuff.
Yeah, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian.
Yeah, if you don't mind, since you said you like it, I thought your artist statement was really cool. I'm going to read that if you don't mind. It says, "The past is great, but the present is greater. Ask someone else what I've done. Ask me what I'm doing. Most of my work involves honoring and learning from the past to create the sound of the future. I'm a blend of that old familiar tune, the beauty of every moment that is now, and a mark of the questionable things to come. I'm the past, present, and future. I'm connecting the dots through sound in time." Very cool. As soon as I read that, I was like, nice.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you enjoyed that.
Yeah, so I thought I might ask you a little, music itself is so rooted in time, right? It's all about time, and I know you're a percussionist, so it's especially important to you. But sometimes the hardest thing to do is to stay in the moment and not get lost in your head. And it seems to me like you have some pretty good angles in your creation process about how you do that and how you keep moving forward with your work. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about that process of yours.
Yeah, so in general, and really over the course of my career, I've always been drawn to some of the things that got buried from the past, left behind, overlooked. And so I leveraged those moments as things that help me in the present moment, in terms of turning them into things that draw attention to previous concepts or help me essentially communicate something that may need to be communicated through me currently. And even in general, in terms of just staying in the moment while I'm creating, I just try to sit down and say, hey, whatever comes out, it comes out. So like when I initially sit down, I try not to overthink. I kind of think of it as like a brainstorm vomit session where I just let myself get all the ideas out, good, bad, ugly, whatever. And then I do that for as long as I can. And so after that, I shut everything down. I come back the next day, maybe an hour or so later, and I say, like, is this good? You know, do I like this? Do I feel anything from this? And then from there, there's a stage where editing begins to take place, and I start to chip away at the musical sculpture, if you will, because, you know, that's just how it happens. Because there was a time in my life where I do think that I got too in my head about the perfection of the thing before it was the thing. You know what I mean? And sometimes you try to over edit or find the sound versus giving it space to emerge through just the organic response that you have to the work as you're building and sculpting it. And I've also, I don't do this as much as I used to, but definitely early in my career, I spent a lot of time composing and producing. Then I was mixing, then I was mastering. And so, you know, sometimes you can lose objectivity when you're a part of the entire process and you don't allow other people to come in, or you don't necessarily have the resources to bring other people in. And so that process that I have kind of developed out of a need for me to not be so critical before the work actually took shape. Because, for example, like I started my EP Geometry in 2017. I didn't drop it until like 2019. And what's crazy about that is I created the 3 songs, triangles, squares, and circles, and I kept playing it over and over. I'm like, something is missing. And I just couldn't figure it out. And there was a point where I was like, wait, does this project suck? Like, what is the missing link here? Like, what am I missing? And literally one day, maybe like a few months later, maybe almost a year later, it dawned on me that I needed interludes to connect the dots between the songs, because thematically they were cohesive, but sonically they weren't. And that's actually how I came up with like my Morse code motif method, where I basically created the interludes using Morse code as the language to spell out the musical, to musically spell out the names of the interludes, but also to create like a motif sonically that tied the entire story together. So like point A, point B, you know, points are geometric terms and concepts and lines and squares, shapes, you know what I'm saying? So it was still in the realm of what I was communicating and somewhat of the metaphor I was building around the story of the project. But it was the glue. And I still use and leverage Morse code even more so now in my work as a film composer, because, you know, it really helps me with creating motifs, especially as a percussionist. We do have we can create things melodically, and we have instruments that, you know, like xylophone vibes and other instruments that have melodic tones, and, you know, but there's still the element of like wanting to prioritize rhythm that Morse code affords me when I'm working in this space. So, yeah.
Okay, so that's drawing from the past. Morse. Let me ask you about that. How do you incorporate Morse code into making music? I mean, there is, I guess, this might reveal how little I know about it, but there's the short sound and the long sound, and through those combinations, I guess it's like a binary code, really, where you can create messages. But there's rhythm and timing in that, but how does that turn into music?
Yeah. So there's the dots and there's the dashes, right? And so when you spell any number of things or a combination of things, there's a rhythmic pattern that you get that however you perceive the timing of it or whatever, you can create the time around it. Or sometimes I use what's called a Morse code translator that once I put in, like, maybe let's say I'll spell out Brian. And so it'll show me the Morse code spelling of your name, but I really use it to hear the rhythm, to see what it sounds like. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
And so from there, it could be the start. Like I could say, oh, that's an interesting rhythm. But a lot of times, especially at this point, I'll just get the spelling and I'll develop the rhythm based on the arrangement of the dots and the dashes. And a lot of times I try to make sure that things are succinct. And it's not just about rhythm too, because of course there's always going to be rhythm when you're making music, because that's how we perceive what's happening most of the time. But there's also like the harmonic structure that goes on top of whatever rhythm I'm playing out, or it could just be, a melodic line and that's it. You know what I'm saying? So that's pretty much the core of like how I achieve that. And it gives me the opportunity to create some variation, to always kind of be surprised and work within certain bounds, because I believe that the more restrictions you have, the more freedom you have, because there's structure and there's a framework. And there's a way to say, like, for example, actually, I was just listening to Quincy Jones's new book. I think it's the 12 Notes on Life and Creativity. And he studied with Nadia Boulanger, and she was saying to him this same concept. And she was like, fortissimo is not just fortissimo without pianissimo.
Right.
And you can't interpret one thing without understanding the opposite end of that, or the things that revolve around it, to have context, to understand how high to go, how low to go, how wide to go. Because otherwise you're just kind of doing, some avant-garde thing that has no linear pattern. And sometimes even the avant-garde things have structure. Like, for example, John Cage, in a lot of his pieces, like one of my favorite pieces of his, I think it's called As Long as Possible. So there are notes on the page, and the only instruction is play as long as possible. But that's up to the musician. So there's like this church, I forget where it is, but they're playing that piece. It's going to take them over 600 years to play it. So people who are involved in that piece over the course of the centuries and the lifetimes, there's going to be so many generations of people that are a part of this piece of music because they've decided to play it this way. Somebody could say long is 5 minutes, and that's as long as possible to them. You know what I'm saying? So it's still like, when people think that there's no order, there is order. There's order to everything. You know what I'm saying? And even with the universe, like, there's order with the universe, even when things seem out of place or out of rhythm with what you can perceive. But, nothing works without some type of structure. And so that's kind of like one of the mechanisms that I use to create structure around my work and my ideas, so that I'm not just pulling things out of the air. And also, of course, working in film and TV, you have to work quickly. And you have to get to a point where you're able to create high level ideas on demand. And so that's another way for me to get to the point quickly, but also still be very creative. And it leaves a lot of room for me to be experimental in nature, but also create something that's digestible to people, even though for me, it's like sometimes it's just an Easter egg situation. And if somebody inquires about it, it's like, oh, that's really cool. But for me, that's the thing that I can put in my work that's satisfying to me at the end of the day, no matter what type of revisions I have to make, or, how other collaborators shape the work in conjunction with what I do. That's just like my thing,
Yeah, that's really cool. So there's not really like hidden Morse code messages then, right?
Oh, no, absolutely.
Could somebody that understands that pick up on it? Oh,
No,
so
absolutely.
cool.
I spell character names. Like I told you, Geometry, the project that the EP that I did, the overture, point A, point B, and the coda, those pieces spell out the titles of those interludes. And sometimes, depending on how potent I may want the motif to be, I may use one letter or two letters of a character's name, or spell out, like if I'm doing a variation of a theme, I may do some more elaborate things. And even for like, so Horror Noir that I did, which was a 2-hour anthology film for AMC and Shudder. And I did the main theme, and that opening sequence on the main theme spells out Horror Noir. So if you go listen to that, and even like go spell out Horror Noir using Morse code and just listen to the rhythm of it, you'll hear together, once you A and B it, you'll hear the expression of that being spelled out. And so, you know, Horror Noir, that's a relatively long line. And I had to be strategic about how I did that, because sometimes like longer passages, the message and the music can kind of get lost in trying to spell out like long words and stuff like that. But that one, that just really worked. And I was like, ooh, okay, you know? So it's also deeper than just the cool element. It's also like, almost like your name, you know, your name has a meaning. For example, EmmoLei, it means industrious, hardworking, you know, filled with the winning spirit. So every time someone says my name, there's a certain energy behind it, right? And so when I'm working and spelling things out, I'm thinking about that, because music is energy. It impacts people in ways that we don't have control over, but there's an emotional element and influence and attachment that people who experience the work have. And so whether they know it or not, they're almost mantras sometimes, or even in my personal work, things that I don't necessarily have to say with my mouth or with lyrics, but it's there and the energy is felt, you know what I mean? And so that's kind of the other part of it too, where you don't always have to be so direct. You can just leave things to the imagination, let people interpret what it is, but there's still concrete meaning that's buried in the word.
Right. That's really cool. And what a perfect name for you based on all I'm learning about you right now. But I agree with you a lot that there's some kind of intangibles that make their way into music, and you can feel it. You know, you feel it in the recordings if people are having fun, or if there's some extra layer, there's something that, like you said, it doesn't even need to be explicitly stated, but the energy gets transferred somehow. And I think the more you put that stuff in your music, the more it becomes interesting and more meaningful. I love that idea of the Morse code too. It's like such a cool way to develop interesting rhythms and things you wouldn't do just in normal playing.
Yep. And it's almost like solving a puzzle, because sometimes I have to figure out like what the best time signature will be to express this line or combination of letters or numbers that I put together to make it translate appropriately. So it then goes back to like the structure of things and how the structure informs your level of creativity in a way. And even to your point about, you know, just not necessarily being completely direct about and spelling things out explicitly. I always remember my middle school band director, Mr. Smith. You know, percussionists always get in trouble because we play loud. We like to play loud sometimes, right? And so we don't always consider the other ensemble, especially when you're young, you're excited to play drums, whatever. And so there were many times where he would just stop completely when we were playing too loud. And he said, "Percussion, you are to be felt, not heard." And he would say that so much. And I'm like, okay. And it's like, yes, we're an integral part of keeping the band together, keeping everything in time. But you don't need to be the star of the show to make an impact. And so sometimes when it's time to communicate certain messages, it doesn't always have to be forward. It doesn't always have to be obvious. And if you catch it, you catch it. If you don't, you don't. But at the end of the day, you're still being impacted by what is being communicated and transferred energetically. You know what I mean? So that's the way that I look at it. And that's just something I keep in the back of my mind when I'm working. And even as I get more mature in the way that I create, because I know like every creative has a point where they're like, I want to be the star of the show. And working in film, you know, there are times where the score becomes a topic of conversation, but really it should be the supporting element, even though it's very important. If you notice that it's there too much, sometimes it may not be the best thing because it's taking people out of the story. So I've had to learn to have some humility with regards to my work. And that's not to be confused with like not moving with confidence, but it's still like, you know, when you look at Google Earth and you type in your address, you just zoom out, you just keep zooming out until you don't see yourself. And it's like, well, shit, I can't see myself anymore. Like I'm important, but like how important is what I'm prioritizing right now in the grand scheme of things? Because we can't see any individual person when we zoom all the way out. And so I just feel like we're little atoms in the universe. You know what I'm saying? You can't see atoms, but they're very important to the structure of our civilization and everything that's physical. So it's a give and take situation. You know what I mean? That's kind of how I view it.
Some astronaut, and I have no idea who, but when this astronaut, I'm not even sure, man or woman, but when they were outside of Earth and in space looking at Earth, the comment was something like, it makes you get this feeling of like oneness with it. And I wish I could drag every politician, every policymaker, grab them by the shirt and say, look at that, you son of a bitch. And look at what we are. This is us. And that's, you know, that's, I think music does that to people when, especially when you start playing in these ensembles and playing with other people and realizing that sometimes your best is when you're not forefront or you're playing a supportive role. And I know in my own music production, it became obvious because every single part I made, I was like, yeah, let's put that up front. Put it up front.
Right.
But to go back to what you said earlier, if everything's up front, nothing's up front. You need things in the back. You need some distance, just like you need the quiet to have the loud. You need the small to have the big. And that kind of perspective is an important thing to keep an eye on. And even I've heard them say, you know, again, I'm not a scientist here, but when you zoom in close enough to us, there's no definitive outline. Our molecules are kind of interacting with each other. There's no real, the desk I'm sitting at looks porous at that level. And I think that's a pretty cool thing too, that there's almost no division between us in that way of thinking.
I think even with you mentioning that, that just made me realize that we're actually like, where definition exists, that's really the in between. Because when you think about it, the extremes is you don't see any definition when you zoom out and you don't see any definition when you zoom in. So really, we're in the in between. And the irony of that is that we think we're the most important part of that. And it's like, I don't know. You know what I mean? So, and to be honest, you know, like I said, everything is integral to things functioning at a certain point. Like we all need each other. And, you know, some things in the world may not function or exist for your benefit, but it's there for someone else or something else that is still a part of our ecosystem. So still, when you get to the core of it, we do need each other. You know what I mean? So that's, I don't know, that's really the way I look about life in general. And I really try to approach my, not only my collaborative relationships, but like my familial relationships, my friendships with that understanding that, you know, it's not about you. It's about us. It's about, you know, flowing with the evolution of the moment because we're constantly changing. Like my dad used to say, you get older every second. And as a kid, that just blew my mind because I started thinking about that and I was freaking out at one point because I'm like, well, yeah, that's actually true. And I'm like getting older, I'm deteriorating. But it's actually very poetic and beautiful when you think about it too. Because depending on your mindset, it just makes you prioritize things a little bit differently, or just what you focus on shifts. And in that moment, I realized like, oh man, like there's a time, there's a clock on my life, and like I need to be present. I need to make the most of what we have because I don't exist forever. No one does. No moment exists forever. So, you know, sometimes I'll just stop what I'm doing and just like look around like, man, there was a time that I envisioned everything around me. And then there will be a time where I look back and it won't be here anymore. And it'll just be a memory. You know what I mean? And so even sometimes like I'll touch things around me because I know that like one day they won't be there. Or even people, I just like, hey, can I have a hug, please? Because like someday we won't exist. And the memory of that embrace or the memory of that moment will be the thing that like carries you through another moment, or it's just like a sweet memory. And we need those things, you know what I mean? So I just think about the vastness of like all things and how we're interconnected, and time is a very heavy theme in my life. I'm always mindful of time, and I sometimes try to like with my mind like slow moments down because I believe that have you ever like put something in the microwave, you set it on 1 minute and you're like, whoa, that went by really quickly. But then there are times where it takes forever and you're like, I only put it on 1 minute, like why is this taking so long? And in those moments too, I'm thinking to myself, our minds can kind of control the perception of how long or how short a moment is, and also our attention and our ability to remove distractions can impact the way time flows as well. You know what I mean? So it's almost kind of like that. What's that Adam Sandler movie where he could pause time?
Christopher Walken, right? Wasn't he in
no,
that?
it's like clock.
He had the remote control, I think, right?
Yeah, I can't remember the name of that, but that movie, I love that movie.
Was it like Click or something like that?
It might have been something like that. I definitely think it was something that started with a C.
Afterwards. Yeah. Wow, what a cool thing to be told as a kid by your dad, you know, just to, hey, you're always getting older. I said this to my students and my high school students, just like, you're the oldest you've ever been right now. And sometimes they're like, whoa, you know, or just enjoy this day because you're never going to get this day again. It's gone forever. And it makes you kind of say, oh yeah, maybe I should do something with, you know, whatever day this is, because it comes around once. And a lot of times it doesn't even become a memory. It just slips away if you're not careful.
That's very true. That is true. Because when you think about all the life you've lived, there are only a handful of moments that you kind of remember in very distinct ways. But the other stuff is kind of like, yeah, it happened, but I don't remember the details. So I don't know. That's very interesting. Yeah.
I've been doing something for the last 2 months that I got from an author, Matthew Dix. He wrote a book called Storyworthy and another one called Someday is Today, which is, you would love it.
Yeah. Okay.
Someday is Today, especially, just based on what we're talking about here. But one of the things he does to capture stories in his life, he calls it homework for life. And all that is every day, just write down something interesting that happened that day. And it could be anything. It could be a really big event, or it could just be you had a fun joke with the person that made your coffee today. Just something that you'll remember the day. It shouldn't take you more than like a minute or two so that you'll actually do it.
Right.
And I had him on the podcast. A lot of fun
Mm.
to talk to. And since then, I've been doing my homework for life, where every day I just write down something.
Right.
And it's really cool to look back. Oh, on April
Mm.
12th, that's what I was doing. And I remember that now. A
Mm.
memory that would have, or an event that would have never even become a memory.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
also, the other bonus is now I start looking for things like, what am I going to write today? Like, oh, that was pretty cool. I had that little laugh with that
Yeah.
stranger, or the way somebody said this, or little things start popping up and you start noticing. And it does slow down time a little bit that way,
Ooh.
where you kind of capture things. And even some of them have made it into ideas for songs.
Right.
Um, it's it's really valuable. I think maybe the title "Homework for Life" is a little off-putting because no one likes homework, but
Yeah.
it's something actually I told my students at school. I said,
Mm.
if anyone wants to do this, I will add points to your report card grade at the end of the quarter.
Ooh.
And it's not because of the points. I don't care about that. It's because I honestly think this will make you enjoy your life a little bit more.
Right. No, I agree. What's interesting about that is I can't even remember who did this, but I came across this video where I think the guy, like, so basically this guy as a kid recorded a voice note to himself. And so I think his daughter found it, like just cleaning out things after he had passed. And I think around that point, he was like 65 or something. And basically the recording was of him telling himself what he was going to be. Like, just, it was almost as if he had lived in the future and came back and was like, you're going to be this, you're going to be that. By this time, you should be doing this. And literally, he became all of those things. And a lot of those things transpired. And it's almost as if once you write things down, because there are things that I've written down, not necessarily every day, but I find myself scribbling the same things in different notebooks. And like some months might pass or some years might pass, and I'll come back and I'm like, oh, snap, that happened. And it's almost as if the physical act of making a thought a thing on paper first, it subconsciously makes you figure out ways to connect dots through actions in other ways, because it's almost like you've made a pact with yourself to make this thing happen. And it might not happen the way that you think it's going to happen, because there are plenty of times where some things I might have wrote down, I want this to happen in 2 years. And it's like, okay, didn't happen in 2 years. And I'll revisit it. And I'm like, dang, okay, this didn't happen. And I'll just be like, okay, well, now I'm open to it happening, but like, I'm open to it happening how it needs to. And it'll end up working itself out. And I'm like actively pivoting or making steps to make the thing happen. And so that is really valuable. And actually, I might do that and also do the audio component, because I also think it's very interesting to hear the progression and the change of your voice over time. Because I don't have many recordings of me as a kid, but I have videotapes. And actually what's crazy is my parents bought me one of these like these kiddie video recorders, and I was always like recording things to the
That's cool.
VHS tape. And there was one time where I like went back to watch that and I'm like, wow, I sounded like that. That's so interesting. So just being able to hear the progression of your voice and just hear what was happening in that time, even if somebody is in the background, like speaking to you, or even I've started saving voice notes, like voicemails from family members who, may have died already. And it's like, dang, I'm glad I saved that, because now I can hear their voice, over and over. And it allows me to keep the spirit of them alive, because there have been people who are important to me that have passed, where it's like, I'm like, so many years have gone between that moment and now, to where it's like, it's hard to recall the exact tone of their voice or like certain things that had I documented them better, it would have been fresher on my mind, you know? And so that's actually a good idea. I'll probably implement that and just make a copy of it as a voice note and write it down too. So like if anything happens, we have both or we have one or the other, depending on how things get preserved. But yeah.
Right. I hope you do,
Yeah,
because
no, I
it's
am gonna do
brought me a lot of
that.
value, and
Yeah.
it. I like the voice idea too. I think
Mm.
part of the trick is to keep it really short, so that
Yeah,
like
for sure.
it's only going to take you a minute. So
Right, right.
it's an easy hurdle. But I
Yeah.
do the same thing with voicemails too. I've got ones
Mm.
from various family members and people I care about. Some of them are because they're funny, or sometimes
Right.
just something they said. But my uncle passed away a couple years ago, and I had
Mm.
one that I saved of him after I sent him a birthday present, and it was him kind of laughing. He had this like really big laugh, you know,
Right.
and after he passed, I came across it and like sent it around, and everyone was happy to hear it.
Mm.
And I think because our voices are so personal, you can
Mm-hmm.
kind of like identify anybody's voice just by hearing it if you know
Right.
them. And there's something, I guess, like really deeply rooted in our evolution, probably
Mm.
for our survival, that, oh, that's a friendly voice. That's the person in my tribe that I can trust.
Mm. Oh, you just made me think about something.
What's that?
So there was a TED talk that I watched that basically talked about it wasn't exactly this, but it was speaking on why we perceive lower tones. Like for example, men with really deep voices, like position of power, or potentially like a threat, because a deep voice is sometimes an indicator of the size of a thing.
Hmm.
Right. So like, oh, this is a deep voice. So I may be in danger because whatever's around me is bigger or more overpowering. Versus like, even when they talked about women giving speeches, why scientifically sometimes the timbre of a woman's voice is harder to digest for long periods of time because of how our brains perceive the frequencies.
Hmm.
And so in speaking classes, sometimes women are coached to drop their voices down so that their message is more effective. And some people think that it's like, oh, you're trying to do this and do that, but it's like a scientific thing in terms of how our brains process sound frequencies and in relation to our safety, even though like at this point in our modern society, we're not always um, leveraging sound as much as we need to for safety and just indicators of when we're in danger or not. But like, even when you think about um, when we were mainly like hunters, you know what I mean? Listening and having too much sound was really an indication of danger, because maybe there are animals or a herd of animals nearby, and you know, you may need to gather the troops so that you guys can either move if you're a nomadic tribe, or if you're stationary, like, hey, is this dinner tonight? Do we need to mobilize everybody to
Right.
capitalize on this moment? You know what I'm saying? Because we might not get this opportunity again. And so I thought that was really intriguing, because it is almost like a fingerprint, and it's also an indicator of something that's just very specific that we can latch onto. And it like it communicates a lot of different things, like the voice, you know what I
Hmm.
mean? The pitch of the voice, and even just the character and tone. Like some people have a smoky tone naturally. And um I don't know, like as a kid, there was a point where I was ashamed of my voice because it was deeper than a lot of my like female peers. And over the course of time, I'm just like, hey, it's unique, because again, when I walk in a room and people hear my voice or they know my voice, it's so distinct to where it's like, oh, there's Emily. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And so I begin to just embrace it. You know, I don't know why my voice is like this, but hey, it is my voice. So I just had to embrace it and figure out how to use it in ways that were interesting to me. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I guess you might as well, right? Because there's not a lot
Right.
you can
You
do
might
about
as
it
well.
anyway. I mean,
Yeah.
done that with singing. I'm not a trained
Exactly.
singer. I'm not really even that good, but I've learned how to use it a little bit, I think,
Yep. Same.
over decades of trying to figure
Mm-hmm.
it out. And a lot of the usefulness of it came when I just sort of accepted that I'm not going to be
Mm-hmm.
this kind of singer. I'm not going to be that, but I can kind of do this thing a little bit.
Right.
And you know what you said about frequencies also reminded me of something I saw. It might have been a TED talk as well, but it was talking
Mm-hmm.
about, uh, I think it's called the Munson-Fletcher curve,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. But it's kind
Mm-hmm.
of, you know how when you see like microphone frequency
Frequency.
layouts,
Yeah.
and they show you like where the little dips and spikes are.
Right.
Our ears are very tuned to things like in like 1K area.
Mm-hmm.
And for a long time, my mixes would be like really harsh in that area,
Yep.
1K, like really boosting that. I'm like, what is this? Why is this so sensitive to me? And they were talking about other sounds that are in that frequency range. And it's things
Mm-hmm.
like sticks breaking.
Mm.
So, like, we're really tuned to that because that might mean danger is coming, like there's a
Mm-hmm.
predator. So, if you can picture like those types of
Mm.
sounds that really cut
Yeah.
through to us,
Yeah.
we're really sensitive to that stuff because evolutionarily speaking, we're sitting here in these like nice shelters and we're on the
Right.
internet talking. This is so new to
It
us,
is.
but we
Yeah.
have 100, 200,000 years of evolution where we're outside, like you said, hunting. And that's like the hardware we're built with. And it's, it permeates so many of the things we do that,
Yeah. You know, that made me think about the fact that safety is an illusion, right? And so we're in these homes, we're in these buildings, and they have given us the illusion that we're separate from nature. So we've evolved in our day to day towards moving in ways that we don't leverage some of our safety mechanisms that are built into us as human beings. Like we don't use them the way we should to continue strengthening them because we just haven't built that world. Like we're not building our world in that way. We're actually building the world to handicap us in a lot of different ways. And I am just actually really intrigued with what the humans will look like later down the line based on the way technology is moving. Because I just got my ears checked last week. Like so Music Cares does this like with the Recording Academy, they do this thing where, you know, musicians can just like do a temperature check, preventative care, whatever, on their
nice.
ears. And so I did that. I'm like, hey, let me just see how well I'm taking care of my ears. You know what I mean? We sit in studios, we have headphones on a lot of times. And in
Concerts.
college, yeah, and in college, I learned something very specific about the anatomy of the ear that really just changed the way I use headphones and everything for life. And it was the fact that we have these tiny little hairs in our ears called organ of corti that do not grow back once they're destroyed. And those are responsible for us perceiving frequency. So, you know, fast forward, I took this test last week and I got the chart, to see. And I'm like, oh, wow, okay, like good. Because I use acoustic filters, like when I'm in venues, on planes, all of that. And I move about the world in a way where I have the understanding that like my ears before they make me money help me preserve and keep my safety intact. And so even as a kid, like I know when my dad would come in the house, I knew the sound of my dad's keys and his footsteps versus my mom. So it's like if one of them had told us to do something and I heard the keys, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm safe. But that's not mom yet. Like, okay, so I have a few more minutes to clean up or do something. But even still, people are like, what are you listening to? Don't you just listen to music all the time? And I'm like, I actually don't. I try to keep my environment as quiet as possible. There are designated times that I have to listen to music, but I try not to listen to music with headphones, like for extended periods of time. If I know I'm going to be in a loud environment, I have acoustic filters, and I typically try to carry them everywhere I go because there have been too many places I've been where I've been surprised by loud things, and I'm like, okay, never again. I need to have this with me. But I feel like collectively as a society, we are not active listeners anymore. We're passive listeners. And even I'm just so like, I'll say when my friends get not necessarily afraid, but they get a little on edge when something is too quiet. And I'm like, what? You need to be able to hear your environment. Like when there's too many sounds going on, you are actually vulnerable because you don't know what to listen for if something's actually happening. And so I don't know. I just think that's a really, I think that's a thing that we should try to figure out how to get people to revert back to understanding why our ears are here, what they're designed to do outside of pleasure. And in general, I feel like everything we do in a modern society anyway is currently built around convenience and pleasure versus function and safety, because, you know, again, everything is kind of becoming a handicap, even in a little ways like, you know, AI, there's conversations about that. And it's kind of like people have compared it to what the calculator did, where people, when the calculator came out, it's like, oh, you're not going to be able to, you know, compute things quickly.
Arithmetic,
yeah. And again, I'm one of those people that I embrace technology to a certain point because I do value just doing things that keep me sharp. Because, like, for example, my wife and I, we were this weekend, we did like a little staycation. And so we decided to leave our phones in the room. And when we went down to buy food, we checked out and the lady's like, hey, can we have your phone number so we can text you when it's done? And we both looked at each other like, dang, we are really in a world where now everything is like, you need your phones. And so that was an interesting exercise because even there were times where we had like the urge to like check for our phones. And it's like, dang, are we really at this point where like that's the priority and we can't do simple things anymore without our phone? Even sometimes cashless places where like you may not have your card, but you use the Apple Wallet to like pay for stuff. You know what I'm saying? And I just thought that was very interesting. And even have you heard of this book called In Pursuit of Silence?
No.
Okay, so there's this book I read in grad school called In Pursuit of Silence, and it's also Patrick Shin did a documentary based on the book. But there was a part in the book where George, the author, he went to visit the Maasai tribe. And basically what he did was he stood two people from the tribe like a few football fields apart. And they were able to have a conversation at a regular tone and still hear each other. And in that moment, I thought, man, there are still parts of the world where people are leveraging their hearing for safety, or their world just hasn't gotten loud enough to where their hearing has been damaged as much as ours has. Because, you know, things are either strengthened or, you know, destroyed depending on the environment you're in. And, you know, the Western society is loud. We're overstimulated. There's no attention and care collectively to, you know, things that prioritize our well-being. And so that made me think like, okay, that was another turning point where I just said, hey, I need to be in a position where if somebody took me and stood me a few football fields apart, I could do the same thing. You know what I mean? Because that's sharp. Like that's just immaculate hearing. You know what I mean? And I just also, I'm terrified of like, of course, things we're like hard drives, you know, the needle keeps spinning on the disk and eventually it wears down. So there's natural wear and tear, but I'm just terrified of like getting old and I can't hear anything. I'm
Hmm.
just like, I can't have that happen. So I'm very conscious about preserving just all parts of my body as well as I can. You know what I mean?
Hmm. That's a smart thing because it's the one vehicle we get,
Yeah,
at least up until this point, anyway.
that's very true.
And those are, especially when music is, a profession and a love and it's so important to preserve. And you're so right about protecting your hearing, especially in loud places. But
Hmm.
even that break, it's when you're mixing, right? Like after
Yeah,
a little while, you kind of have no idea how it sounds. You really need to
exactly.
step away and reset. Like our senses are
Hmm.
so used, they really operate on change, I think, or
Yeah.
we notice movement or change. So, um, it's like why you can have an air conditioned humming for an hour and you don't notice it till it
Hmm.
shuts off.
Yeah.
So when getting away from your mix, you come back and you're like, oh my God, it's so trebly, or there's no bass in here, or whatever
Yeah.
it might be.
There
And
there was a there was an NPR there was an NPR thing that I listened to too that talked about that concept where like the brain is conditioned to recognize patterns. So it's kind
mm,
of like people say you know or people just wonder, especially like folks that try to create outside of traditional or I'll just say things that are like digestible, right? It's like, man, why don't people like avant-garde music or just, aleatoric, like all this stuff that doesn't have distinct patterns or like linear movement. And it's because scientifically we're not wired to like that. We are wired to resist that or find or seek out the patterns in all of that information for our safety, right? Because our brain is trying to say, like, I need to find something familiar. I need to find something
mm,
familiar. Otherwise, we start resisting. And it's almost like it sends signals to your body, like, okay, I need to be worried about something because I can't find the pattern.
mm,
Um, and that also changed me too, because there was a point where I was very resistant to creating, not necessarily within the scope of the machine, but just like I was deep into my experimental bag, and a lot of that stuff is very intriguing to me, even still. But I realized that the science behind music and sound, not necessarily to be liked and to get accomplishments or to get accolades, but it's just like in general to move the masses, there has to be some type of pattern that people can latch onto, and you can determine what that is, and what people determine is good or bad that changes over time. But if there's a pattern, there's at least a chance that a community of people will gravitate to it. And so
mm,
that completely changed the way I made music too, because I was like being resistant for the sake of being resistant, and it's like, no, there really is a science behind this. And if you want to be successful, figure out the balance between your experimentation and making something that's relatable or that has enough of a pattern to where people can say, oh, okay, I can
mm,
feel something from this. Because, you know, again, frequencies, uh, they impact our bodies beyond what most people understand. Like I used to research the ancient solfeggios and like the frequencies that were in place before equal temperament became a thing, which is like what our tuning system is based on. And there are certain frequencies, like I became fascinated with sonic weapons. And it's like,
mm,
what? There are things that you can use sound to destroy things. That's people don't realize how powerful sound is. It's
mm,
it's crazy because everything has a resonant frequency. So if you blast a frequency that's the same resonant frequency as this table loud enough, you could break the table just off of projecting the sound of this table at it. You know what I'm saying?
mm.
It's like, whoa, wait a minute. It almost makes me think like, should everybody have access to being a musician or whatever if you don't really understand like what you got going on? Because you're really impacting people at a molecular level, actually, when they're listening to your music, which is why certain songs we listen to make our bodies do certain things, or we just have certain reactions to memories when we listen to music. And it's some things that we can't explain, but it's a reason behind it. Like, I don't know. It's just, I think about these things so much. It's so
It's
intriguing
amazing,
to me.
yeah. Well, that like idea of like the opera singer shattering the
Yeah,
glass or
it's the
something.
same concept. Yeah. It's like the pitch that she's singing is the same resonant frequency as the glass. So after a certain point, it's almost like they're colliding and they're pushing against each other. You know what I mean?
Mm.
But it's like something canceling itself out, pretty much. You know what I mean? That's basically
Hmm.
what it is. And so that's powerful, you
Well,
know?
that's an amazing phenomenon when you flip the phase on a sound
Exactly.
recording and it's gone. There's
Exactly.
nothing
That's
left
the
over.
same concept. Yeah,
So
yeah,
strange.
yeah.
One of my earliest profound feelings towards music was as a little kid, I was angry about something, I didn't get my way,
Mm,
something stupid. And I put on some music, and by the time the song was done, I was in a great mood. I was happy.
yes.
And it
Yes.
kind of stopped me, and I realized, like, hey, I was just pissed off about something,
Mm-hmm.
and now I'm not. Like, what is that all about?
Yeah.
What happened there? Like, but whether it's the vibrations, just the combination of the melodies and the beats, and I mean,
Mm,
it makes people dance. It wakes you up in the morning if you put on the right thing. It can put you to sleep.
yeah.
It's, it is. I think you're really right, and to think about the actual, like the down to the molecular level of like
Yeah.
what's happening, and what you said about the hairs in the ear. Somebody once, I don't know where I heard this. I think someone just told me like sound is really touch.
Yep.
It's vibrations of
Yep.
air. It's
Mm-hmm.
just a very fine-tuned version of touch, and then it's like, oh
Yep.
wow, like, and then we have like these, that song touched me, and you know
Yeah.
this,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
there's so much going on there.
Wow.
It's
Mm.
hard to, it's hard to even like fathom how amazing, like if this was a program somebody wrote, you'd just be like so blown away by it, yet it's just natural. It's just what happened.
Have you ever looked at light waves on a paper next to sound waves?
No.
Hmm. So when you get a chance, do that. They pretty much are like
Like
almost
compare the two.
identical. Yeah, they're pretty much the same. And the reason why I say that is because one day I had a thought because I was like, I forget, it was something happening on Twitter where people were dissecting like um why music and just why certain artistic mediums were more popular than the other. And I just thought about like number one, we perceive the world in a sense in like a binary where there's zeros and ones, light and sound. Light pretty much informs what we see, and sound, of course, like what we hear. And everything around that, we pretty much base that off of what we can see and hear. And I thought to myself, oh my God, like what if sound and light are God? Like, you know what I mean? That's like another one of those significant binaries where it's like one and the same, but it's not. You know what I mean? Even with like men and women, we're human beings, but we have two separate roles. And when we come together, it's like a beautiful collaboration in terms of keeping like civilization going, and just the collaboration of what men are great at versus women or whatever the case may be. You know what I'm saying? However we leverage the energy, not necessarily like the physical manifestation of a man or a woman, but just like the energy, whether the masculine energy is present in a woman or whatever the case may be. But it's like thinking about the energy and pairing the light and sound together, and how it's one of those things that can manipulate a given situation, like the psychology behind looking at something and hearing something completely separate, but when it's married together, it also creates this psychological effect that can change what somebody's mood is, like you said, or what their decision making ends up, like how they make decisions. And even thinking about like, okay, when they say be careful what you listen to or be careful what you watch, it's like that's real. Because music, sound, visual stimulation, like all of those things are psychological manipulators. And if used incorrectly, they're very powerful mediums. You know what I'm saying? And it's like, okay, why do we prioritize musicians? Like people subconsciously put musicians and, filmmakers and people that work in visual mediums on this pedestal. And I was analyzing, like, why is that? Why are like people that work in these fields like gods to people? And it's like, there's a sense of the creator going through these people and they're creating these powerful messages. And it's like, in general, I think anybody, because we're all capable of creating something, but I feel like there's this perception that people don't necessarily recognize, but like anybody that can create something from nothing, I feel like they automatically they end up on this pedestal, whether they realize it or not, especially when they execute at a high level, because it's almost like creativity is the closest thing to God. You know what I mean? And so I thought about that like connection, and I'm like, oh my God, this is just like being a creative person and working in a field where you have to do that for a living and your work is distributed to the masses. Like that's a huge responsibility. Most people do not view it that way. But when I think about these types of concepts, it's like, it's heavy in a good way, because it's like, okay, cool. And there are times where I can, I create separation from like what's entertainment, but that's why, like I said, I'm always intentional about what I put in my work. And sometimes things don't always need to be spelled out. Like I said, it just needs to be felt. And, Da Vinci's work wasn't always understood in the moment. There's stuff that's left to be explored. You know what I mean? And I try to implement that in some kind of way, but also still stay present with the moment. So it's like, you can leverage things from the past. You can create things that people can understand and relate to in the moment. And then you leave things for the future, where people can still find something that somebody didn't discover in the moment when you were alive to experience people's reaction or whatever the case may be. You know what I mean? So it's almost like you're time traveling all the time. You know what I mean? It's like you're here, but you're time traveling. So we can time travel.
Right. Well, that kind of goes with your statement we went over in the beginning, right?
Yes.
And if you think of it that way, I mean, because you're so right, it really is like a powerful thing, and it's easy to miss that. But what you can do with sound and any kind of creation, any kind of art, is really change people.
Yeah.
Even if it's a tiny bit, that's a lot. Yeah. And that's a pretty incredible power. And it makes it all the more cool and interesting that you're bringing so many of those kind of things in. And like we said earlier, like they might not be obvious. You might not, like your band director said, you might not hear it, but you do feel it.
Yeah.
And it all kind of adds up into some weird thing that is definitely a little beyond our understanding, I think.
Yeah.
But we do recognize that there's a power to it.
There is. And even, like there was a point where I used to listen to like Indonesian gamelans. And of course their tuning system is completely different from ours. So even learning about how people create music, basically in the in-between, like, using frequencies that we don't even necessarily acknowledge as like notes and things that we don't use that are basically dissonant to us. It's like in this part of the world, that is like our music is somewhat of a foreign concept, and it might sound weird and dissonant to them. You know what I mean? So I don't know. I just know that no matter what the framework is in terms of how you perceive sound, what's dissonant, what's consonant, or whatever the case may be, all of the things that we can hear and even the stuff that falls outside of our hearing range as humans, it's like it's there, it's impacting us, whether we realize it or not. And sometimes I just wish like I could hear what animals hear, because a lot of different animals can hear like below our lowest point and above the 20K. And I'm like, what does that stuff sound like? Because, there are times where people have said they notice animals moving weird or fleeing or something before an earthquake or something. And they perceived what was happening in the earth sonically and maybe even felt it. But I think it's more attached to sound because of what their ears can perceive. And that's like, hey, hold up, something's about to happen here. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah. I routinely see the birds start freaking out before it rains. And I've seen videos of that where like the dog gets up and kind of like moves around, then the earthquake happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it is, yeah, it's wild, right?
Yeah.
What is going on out there?
It's almost as if by design, for sure, some things we just don't need to access because could we handle that information truly? Yeah. And it might be best that only the animals can perceive it, because look at what we're doing with what we can perceive,
Yeah, well, a lot of what the mind does is filter out information.
Right. Yeah, so,
I know we're getting near the end, so we should probably wrap it up. But wow. That was, I mean, there are a lot of stones here that I would have loved to overturned with you. And
well, yeah, what did you have some more stuff you really wanted to ask? We can.
Oh, it's just all of this stuff. I mean, we went into this with the adventurous spirit of just seeing where it would go, and it
took a left turn.
I wasn't prepared for it. To be honest with you, I was surprised. So it's really cool. But maybe we can, I don't know what I'm going to name this episode, because this is one that has all kinds of possibilities. But maybe we can tell people like where you like to send them to hear some of your work, because I'm sure by now, that's something people want to check out. Any place in particular that's especially like the home? I know I have your website, esankofa.com.
e-sankofa.com. That's pretty much where all of my work is housed.
It's a nice site too. Different.
Thank you.
Little fun.
Yeah, I like to change my website a lot. So you may come back to it and it's different, but it'll always be there.
Okay, nice.
I'm like obsessed with the seasons and shifting with where my creativity is moving and where I just feel visually communicates where I'm at the moment. I wish you could have seen the geometry site. That was one of my favorite designs ever. But no, e-sankofa.com. You can find me there. You can literally also type EmmoLei Sankofa into Google and my work will pop up. And, wherever you listen to music, whether that is Spotify, Tidal, Apple, Deezer, wherever, you can pretty much find most of my work. Although my full discography is on my website and Bandcamp. Because I've done like some remixes and stuff that I couldn't release or distribute for, real exploitation. It's just kind of like a fun thing that I did. But that's pretty much where you can find me. Yeah.
Nice.
And also my work is on Hulu 3 ways. You can watch that on Hulu. Step Up, I did season 3 of that. That was on STARZ, but that's not there anymore. I think they're figuring out where they want to put that. But let's see. I have some stuff coming out more, probably later this year, like some films and TV shows and stuff like that. But yeah, Horror Noir, that's out too. AMC, Shudder. really just everything you can find it. Lizzo's Watch Out for the Big Girl season 1. I worked on that too.
Right. That's cool.
Yeah. So there are many things to digest here.
Right. Yeah, and I'll put a lot of that stuff in the show notes so people can find it and get into your world a bit too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, cool. Anything before we go?
Stay present.
Yes. I agree.
Stay present.
Well, thanks so much. That was a really cool conversation. I wasn't aware how much my mind would be blown, and I appreciate it very much.
No, thank you for having me. Seriously, this was fun. fun.
I had a great time.
Do you watch Hot Boxing with Mike Tyson?
No, I haven't.
Oh man, please watch. He has a podcast called Hot Boxing with Mike Tyson. Yeah. Yes, and really start from like the earlier episodes, that because Eben was his co-host originally, but they ended up parting ways, but he's still doing it. But regardless, like Mike Tyson's brain is just the way he thinks about life. Like he's so intelligent, and he just knows a lot of things way deeper than most people might anticipate. And it's like, what, like, when do you have time to study this or like learn about this? You know what I mean? But yeah. He's a fascinating character, and I've seen some podcasts with him, and you're just kind of like, wow, you're surprised at the depth of him, especially when if you just know him from boxing. Yeah, but it's a beautiful way to kind of see the evolution of a person, and actually, it made me realize that we have to give people space to change, because there's good in everyone. And although people's moral compass doesn't align with you, like sometimes people's moral compass just doesn't align, and that's that. You don't have to engage. But there's always space for people to become better than they were. And oftentimes, if someone is ever negative, or they're doing things that are like, man, you are a fucked up person, it's like, what caused them to go there? And I always ask that question first and try to approach people from a level of humanity, because we all come here as babies and we evolve into who we are going to be, and there are experiences and things that trigger decisions that change our lives and who we become. You know what I mean? So I'm like, damn, I need to know the story. Like, how did this person become who they were? And that's also not necessarily you should not ignore when someone is just, they're messed up and you need to leave it where it is. But it's still like intriguing sometimes to figure out the story, because when you get to the point, the villain origin story, I say it's like, oh, that makes sense. Right. That's unfortunate, but it makes sense why you are who you are. And so even now, like as an adult, I'm like digging into my parents and asking them things that I would be out of line for asking them as a kid. And it's like, oh, wow, that's why that happened. Or that's why you said that, or that's why we couldn't know this and know that. So I'm like, man, okay. Like, it makes you appreciate people more, and also it informs that maybe you need to continue to stay away. You know what I mean? And let them unfold however they're going to unfold, because they're at a point of no return. You know what I mean? So
I think that idea of picturing people as a baby is really helpful.
Yes.
Like, all of these people were once babies, and and none of us get to be anybody else. So I don't know what you're, I can never be that. You could never be me. And certainly none of us were ever Mike Tyson. No one was ever that. No one was ever any of these people ever. Yeah. Including you and me. So, but we all have our origin story, like you said.
I mean, even with Mike Tyson, like you'll hear him say a lot, he got teased as a kid, and his turning point was when this, like, he had pigeons as pets.
Yeah, I've seen that.
And one day, a man came and took his pigeon and pulled the head off, and that just completely unraveled him. And he was like, from that point forward, he decided nobody was ever going to mess with him or pick on him again. And that's when he started fighting, literally at 9 years old, fighting grown men for money, knocking grown men out. Like, that was just the turning point. And so it's like, you have a peaceful little kid minding his business. He has a speech impediment. Okay, cool. But like, why would you as a grown man do that to a kid? That's psychologically that destroyed him. You know what I mean? And so luckily he's evolved, but he could have had a different story. And at one point in his life, he did. Yeah. He had a terrible, terrible situation.
He was in jail. He bit Evander Holyfield, like very public fallings too.
Yes.
As then, you know, some of the later matches, but no one ever went through that.
Yeah.
He's the only one.
Right.
So yeah, that's a great point you make.
Compassion. That's all it boils down to.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to the Music Production Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with EmmoLei Sankofa. Sometimes these things get deep and philosophical, and this is a good example of that, and I thank EmmoLei for that. Please be sure to check out her work. And if you want to check out some of my work, you can go to brianfunk.com. And as this episode's words of wisdom, I think we'll leave it with what EmmoLei said: compassion. Take care.